If you're anything like me, you've probably spent plenty of your prayer time talking to God about what you need or even want. Have you ever prayed asking God what He wants from you? And I wonder, have past heroes of the faith asked God what He wants from them? I don't know, but let's look at one of them, a giant of faith in Scripture, Abraham. Here's what the book of Romans chapter 4 and verse 9 tells us about Abraham's faith. His faith was accounted to him, Abraham, for righteousness. Abraham's faith was counted as righteousness, and in some modern translations, that verse, Romans 4:9, reads, Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness. In order for Abraham to receive this faith credit, he endured, like all students in the school of life, several tests. Let's take a look at Abraham's tests. Well, Abraham's first test was a biggie. Abraham and Sarah were enjoying a comfortable life in Ur, a life made rich by family, livestock, and rich with, well, riches. Abraham was wealthy, he was established, and at age 75, God asked him to leave this comfortable home and settle in a new land. His promise? God promised to make this childless couple into a great nation. Well, Abraham packed up his household and riches, and they left that area. On the first part of the test, he scored a clear A, but then he faltered. A famine redirected Abraham's path, and so the men, women, and livestock went down to Egypt. And looking at his beautiful wife, Abraham envisioned the men of Egypt killing him for her. And so he introduced Sarah as his sister. Pharaoh set his sights on Sarah, but God intervened to restore her to her husband's side. First test, Abraham had the faith to upend his life and to set out for an unknown land. But along the way, he struggled to find the faith to trust this same God to preserve his life and Sarah's. Abraham's second test arrived on a dark and cloudless night. God promised to make him the father of many nations. Childless Abraham was confused. Then God took Abraham outside. He looked up at the sky full of bright, shining stars. That's how many descendants you will have, God said. Abraham believed, and God counted him righteous because of his faith. Oh, he aced that test. Well, at the age of 86, Abraham became the proud father of a baby boy. But Ishmael was not his heir. Sarah and Abraham had attempted to fulfill God's promise themselves, and here their faith wavered and they stumbled. But this was not their final test. God didn't set them aside because of this faith failure. He gave them another chance. Abraham and his household moved to another area. Sarah must have been a woman of unmatched beauty because, again, Abraham introduced her as his sister. God intervened again, and he rescued her. Well, after this faith stumble, God still didn't give up on Abraham. His biggest test was next. The promised heir arrived when Abraham was 100 years old. Abraham delighted as he watched his son Isaac grow up in the wilderness. Well, one day he unexpectedly faced the ultimate test. God asked Abraham to take his son, his only son, and sacrifice him as a burnt offering. The next morning, Abraham got up early and he prepared for the trip up the mountain. Hebrews chapter 11, that great faith chapter, it summarizes it this way. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, "In Isaac your seed shall be called," concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead. This final test, it was unique. It was worth 100% of Abraham's credits. It didn't matter that Abraham had failed a few of his earlier tests. In that moment, it also didn't matter that he had passed earlier tests with flying colors. God's request that he sacrifice Isaac counted for 100% of his grade. God wanted to know, Abraham, will you give me everything? Abraham's answer, God will provide. Isaac embodied everything to Abraham. This son was the heir to the promise, the reason for all the tests of faith that had preceded that moment. Abraham, in answering, God will provide, he gave God the answer that he was looking for. And so I ask you today, what does God want from us? He wants us. Romans chapter 12 and verse 1 tells us this. And so, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all he has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind he will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship him. You know, when our girls were young and Sean came home at the end of the day, I was often frazzled. And during those years, I'd welcome him home, and on a bad day, I'd quickly tell him what still needed to be done around the house. The living room is full of toys. There are unfolded clothes piled on the couch, but your dinner's on the stove. Or, worse from his perspective, was, welcome home. I didn't have time to make dinner. I was working on the tax returns, and those still aren't done. And, well, his response was almost always the same. It's okay, he'd say. Just leave the laundry, forget about taxes, and let's make peanut butter sandwiches for dinner. The kids won't care. They'll love it. Then sit down. I just want my wife. Well, I'd sit down, but I'd be fidgety. My mind would still be thinking about the laundry and the taxes and all the other unfinished things. You know, it took a long time for me to believe him, that he really wasn't disappointed by my domestic shortcomings, and that he really just wanted my company. Well, Sean's trained me really well now. I just go straight to peanut butter sandwiches for dinner. No, but really, the thing he wants from me is me. And what does God want from us? He wants us. Abraham was willing to give God his son Isaac, and God gave him back. I pray God will find each of us just as willing, and we in turn will be counted as righteous.